Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in the world on the 1st of June of 2026. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, where we see that the Russians right now are trying to improve their positions and improve the situation with long-range strikes and with mid-range strikes. When talking about long-range strikes, the Russians managed to improve their position. The Russians have already improved their position significantly, and when talking about the long-range strikes, this is the situation when the Ukrainians are trying to attack deep inside of the territory of Russia using hundreds of drones like Flamingo type and so on. And as for the long-range strikes, the Ukrainians try to destroy or to damage objects of Russian energy infrastructure, more precisely of fuel, both of fuel and oil infrastructure, gas infrastructure, and so on. And for these purposes, as we discussed during the previous videos, the Ukrainians use trucks. And we have already discussed the situation many times, but just for to understand the picture, the entire picture of the situation, when the Russians found out that the Ukrainians use trucks to attack deep inside of the territory of Russia, the Russians came to the conclusion that the only way how to reduce the number of strikes deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation is to destroy every single truck they find on the territory of Ukraine. And starting from this situation, from the moment when the Russians decided to destroy every single truck, we start receiving lots of updates on this matter. Almost every single day we receive a video or a picture how the Russians destroy this or that truck on this or that part of Ukraine. And when the Russians began destroying all these trucks through the territory of Ukraine, we start receiving updates that the Ukrainians began using less and less drones to attack deep inside of the territory of Russian Federation, which means that based on these updates, we can make a conclusion that the Russians are improving this situation with long-range strikes, and probably in coming days or weeks the Russians will fix this situation completely. And this will of course force the Ukrainians to start thinking what kind of approach they need to use to attack deep inside of the territory of Russia, because we need to understand that Ukraine itself doesn't have any problems with a production of drones. So they're printing their drones using these special equipment, 3D printers. The Ukrainians don't have problems with this. The only problem that Ukrainians have is that they don't have static airfields. They can't use static launching sites, because if they use them, the Russians will destroy them in advance or attack them in advance. So that is why the Ukrainians need to stay mobile and flexible, and then the way to do this is to use trucks. But as the situation that the Russians discovered these Ukrainian tactics, now this is not an advantage of the armored forces of Ukraine, but it's their biggest minus. So the Ukrainians can produce as many as they need. They can produce hundreds, maybe even thousands of drones of this type, but the most important problem, most likely the Ukrainians produce drones somewhere in the western parts of Ukraine, the part of Ukraine that is secured from the Russian attacks, but the problem is that they need to bring these drones on the eastern bank of the river of Dnipro and to launch them deep inside of the territory of Russia. And the only way to do this is to use trucks, but now the Russians know these tactics, so that is why they destroy every single truck they discover, mainly on the eastern parts of Ukraine. Another important thing is mid-range attack. So for mid-range attack from the Ukrainian side, this is the situation when the Ukrainians began establishing a certain control over the territories between Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Crimea, Rostov regions. We're talking about this territory. When talking about mid-range strikes, this is the situation when the Ukrainians use drones and when the Ukrainians attack positions of the armored forces of the Russian Federation, when the Ukrainians attack using mid-range drones, vehicles, fuel trucks, fuel depots, ammo depots, gas stations, and so on. And these attacks, as we can see according to different videos and different reports that have been published since the beginning of April, caused significant damage and caused significant problems for Russians, for their logistics, and for the common fuel situation in this area. And now the Russians are trying to find a solution how to fight these tactics. And the most important thing is not just about the situation that you don't need to use trucks to attack let's say, in the direction of these territories that we have just discussed. The most important thing is that the Ukrainians began using very interesting drones for these purposes. Pro-Russian sources these days are talking a lot about Hornet's drone. Hornet drone is a drone of the US production that has machinery view, that has, as I understand, AI, and that can fly over some certain territory and to find targets by itself and to attack when this Hornet drone decides that this or that target should be attacked by the armored forces of Ukraine. And for example, in this video, we can see how the Russians began destroying such drones over the territories where the Ukrainians established certain control over the Russian logistics. So this is a Hornet drone. This is another Hornet drone that was destroyed by Russians. And as you can see, this is the way how the Russians are trying to improve their situation in this area. But the most important problem of this situation is that the Ukrainians use these Hornet drones with AI. They don't need operator. They don't need a person who will control this drone, because these drones are completely autonomous. They can launch them and these drones will fly over the territory and find for targets. But when talking about the Russian side, as we can see, the Russians, according to these videos and according to reports we receive, need a person who will control this anti-drone with the purpose to control it, to targets and so on. So this is the most important problem, because if we understand, if Ukrainians launch 100 drones, this means that the Russians may need 100 operators, 100 men for the purpose to control their own drones, with the purpose to destroy the Ukrainian drones. And this is the most important problem. But the Russians are trying to find a solution for this situation. These days we receive lots of updates on this matter. For example, in this video we can see the Russian anti-drone, and this is a new anti-drone by the name of Molnia. This drone is much faster, and maybe the Russians are going to use these drones with the purpose to destroy the Ukrainian mid-range drones that currently control the territories between Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, with the purpose not to allow the Russians to establish strong logistics in this area. Another important thing is that these days you might probably see a lot of pictures of this type. Now, according to information we have, the Russians are trying to color their vehicles like this, and the Russians, and according to military experts and according to different sources, the Russians believe that if they color their vehicles like this will allow them to make the situation when a Hornet drone will not recognize this vehicle as a military vehicle. So this is the reason why the Russians began coloring vehicles through these territories, as you can see right now in front of your screen. So very interesting situation. As of now, I can't tell you whether these tactics work or not, but the Russians believe that these tactics work. So of course, let's wait and see what is going to happen next. But telling the truth, when talking about AI, I believe that maybe if these tactics works today, maybe tomorrow these tactics will not work, because AI will learn itself, will teach itself how to recognize targets, even if the targets is colored like this. Now let's move further. So this is the situation with long-range strikes and mid-range strikes, and we see that the Russians are trying to make everything they can with the purpose to stabilize the situation. Once again, as for the long-range strikes, the Russians began hunting and destroying every single truck they discover through the eastern parts of Ukraine. As of the mid-range strikes, the Russians began improving their mobile fire groups. The Russians began deploying lots of FPV drone operators in this area, just drone operators in this area, and the Russians began coloring their vehicles this way, believing that this might help the Russians to reduce the number of strikes from the Ukrainian side. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of very important updates. And first, let's talk about the most important direction, about the Kramatorsk direction. According to information we have, according to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, during the previous 24 hours, the armed forces of the Russian Federation finished the battle for the settlement by the name of Tykhonivka. And these are the changes on the ground between the dates. So this is the end of the 31st of May of 2026, and this is the end of the 1st of June of 2026. According to the report published by the Minister of Defense, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Tykhonivka, and this is a very, very interesting situation. Basically, it's not just an interesting situation, this is the beginning of a crisis, and this is the beginning basically of the battle for the city of Kramatorsk itself. We haven't received even a single video that can confirm Russian control over the territory, but most likely the Russians are not able to do this because, first of all, the distance between the settlement of Tykhonivka and, let's say, the Kramatorsk airfield is already around 9 kilometers, which means that probably there are thousands of drones flying over these territories seeking for Russian positions, so that is why the Russians are not able to make a video. And this is the shortest distance to the city of Kramatorsk, and this distance says that the Russians began battle for the city. And this is a very interesting situation because now we start receiving more and more updates from the settlement of Kramatorsk, where we can see how more and more Russian drones attack vehicles and military forces of the armed forces of Ukraine through the city of Kramatorsk. We haven't seen anything like this since the beginning of the special military operation. Now we see that the conflict on the territory of Ukraine reaches the settlement of Kramatorsk, and the clashes right now are taking place in this area. And most likely the Russians will intensify their activities. You know that since the beginning of the special military operation, there were lots of options, a lot of versions published by different sources of how exactly the Russians were going to begin battle for the Slaviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. But now it seems that the Russians chose a very interesting approach, and the Russians chose such an interesting approach that the Ukrainians were forced to send the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Syrsky, in this area with the purpose to control and to coordinate the defense operation personally. Most likely Syrsky will take this battle in his own hands because he understands that this is not just the battle for the city of Kramatorsk, this is the battle for his career. Because if he loses the battle of Kramatorsk or Slaviansk, he will lose his position. And basically he will lose not just position, but probably even Ukraine may lose the conflict and this war. For example, during the previous 24 hours, we had reports that Zelensky is considering replacement of the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Syrsky, with Budanov. Several sources stated on this matter. According to information we have, he is going to do this, but it's just rumors and talks, and the main purpose of these rumors and talks is just to show Syrsky that this is his final battle. Zelensky is planning to replace General Syrsky as commander of the armed forces of Ukraine, appointing his own office chief Budanov in his place, according to TASS source familiar with the situation. The move is being discussed against the backdrop of visitor to Kiev, the US Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal. So basically the thing is that if Syrsky loses the battle for Slaviansk-Kramatorsk, he will lose his position. So that is why he came to this area with the purpose to control the battle by himself personally. And once again, according to these changes, now we understand that most likely the next village that the Russians most likely will take under complete control is the settlement of Malinovka. The Russians have already begun assault operation in the direction of the village. The Russians have already reduced the village to ruins, and most likely in coming 2, 4, 5 days the Russians will announce complete control over this territory as well. And when it happens, when the Russians establish complete control over these two villages on the Ukrainian side of the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, the Russians most likely would try to break through Ukraine's defense in this area with the purpose to enter the eastern parts of the city of Kramatorsk. And most likely the Russians will do this. Why the Russians are going to do this? This is a very interesting and very interesting situation, because imagine yourself the news, the media of the Western countries and their first pages of their different sources, and the first pages will look like the Russians answered the city of Kramatorsk, the final battle begins. Because if Russians answer the settlement of Kramatorsk, this is going to be like the end, the final phase of the special military operation, or at least the final phase of demands that the Russians issued to Ukrainians in 2024. So leave the Donbas region and the conflict on the territory of Ukraine will finish. And imagine yourself that most likely if Russians enter the eastern parts of the city of Kramatorsk from this direction, and this is just 9 kilometers for this, then of course Zelensky most likely will not receive additional funding from the European countries, because for every single country, for every single leader in the West, this is going to be something like a red flag that everything goes wrong. So that is why the Russians most likely will try to do this, and then they'll see whether it works or not. Of course, during these things, the Russians will continue the battle for the city of Konstantinovka. As for the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything from this area, just lots of attacks and strikes carried out by Russians with aviation. Lots of explosions were recorded through the settlement of Alexeyevo-Drushkovka. These days, we start receiving more and more updates from this area, which means that the Russians began their active assault operation in this area as well. And another important update is coming from the Slaviansk direction. Today, pro-Russian sources published this video, and in this video we can see how the Russians were moving through the settlement of Alexandrovka. Here we can see Russian soldiers that were moving and clearing the territory. And this progress, these movements of Russian soldiers were recorded right exactly in this area. The Russians were trying to secure these buildings, which means that the Russians are already on the territory of Alexandrovka. And telling the truth, I believe that in coming days, maybe in coming 10 days, the Russians will announce complete control over the settlement, which means that this is going to be the collapse of the Eastern Slaviansk defenses. And the Russians most likely will continue offensive operation further in the direction of the settlement of Nikolaevka. So the news around the Slaviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration is tightening. The Ukrainians are no longer holding their positions. The city of Konstantinovka is about to collapse. The Russians crossed the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, and they're just 9 kilometers before the city of Kramatorsk. The settlement of Alexandrovka is about to be captured by Russians. Probably the only area where the Ukrainians have more or less stable the situation is the city of Liman. A week ago, the chief of the general staff of the armed forces of the Russian Federation stated that the Russians controlled up to 85% of the city, but yet we haven't received anything else or anything additional from this area. But probably in coming days, we might see that the Russians will publish some proofs that they control the city, and then the map would be adjusted. But as of now, we see what we have. Another important area and another important direction is the Zaporozhye direction. And according to information we have, according to pro-Russian sources, these days the Russians managed to break through Ukraine's defense to the west of the settlements of Rizdvyanka and Vozdvizhivka, and as a result of offensive operation, first sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the armed forces of the Russian Federation entered this village of Lubitska from the east and managed to dig in deeper. We're talking about the territory of these farms. And this is a very important situation because the Ukrainians have just several more or less reliable roads they can use to supply and support their contingent on the territory of the city of Orekhov, and this is, for example, the first road that goes exactly through the settlement of Lubitska. That's the Russians entered from the east. And the second important road, logistic line, is NO8 road that goes from the city of Orekhov also in the direction of the Orekhov agglomeration. And this update on the ground that was published by pro-Russian sources means that the Russians during the previous 24 hours have almost managed to cut physically one of the most important logistic lines, which means that the situation for the contingent of the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of Orekhov agglomeration is deteriorating. Another important thing and another important area worth attention is the situation is in the Velikonovoselovka direction. Let's discuss this in details as well. These days, pro-Ukrainian sources published lots of updates on the matter that the Ukrainians managed to break through the Russian defense in the area to the east of Velika Mikhailovka and Gavrilovka. And according to several pro-Ukrainian sources, all these territories that I have colored with this yellow line to the west of this yellow line were already captured by the armed forces of Ukraine, and that the Ukrainians continue advancing further. But at the same time, pro-Russian sources stated that the Russians managed to break through Ukraine's defense and that the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the area of the settlement by the name of listening that the Russians continue advancing. So this is a very important situation because one thing is clear that one of them, either the Russians or the Ukrainians, are lying and telling not the real situation. And today, pro-Russian sources stated that the Ukrainians have redeployed the 79th and the 80th Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine with this area with the purpose to begin sending more and more sabotage and reconnaissance mobile group deep inside of the territory that is under complete control of the Armored Forces of the Russian Federation, with the purpose to make dozens or hundreds of videos from different positions, with the purpose to create a media victory and to show the situation to the press. So let's wait and see how the things are going to develop in this area. But one thing is clear, that if it happens, of course, the Russians would be forced to bring additional reinforcements back in this area with the purpose to secure these tree lines and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. And the Ukrainians are doing this counter-offensive operation with the purpose to slow down the Russians in the Orekhov direction. So everything is complicated, and today Zelensky ordered the head of his office, Budanov, to make everything possible with the purpose to have chances and opportunity to finish the conflict on the territory of Ukraine before winter comes, before winter of 2026-2027 comes. Because most likely Zelensky understands that the next winter will be probably the most difficult since the beginning of the special military operation. And most likely this is going to be a complete and total blackout winter without any chances to change the situation. So, of course, let's wait and see what is going to happen next. But it seems that we are entering the most interesting period of time when probably even technology advantages can resolve the conflict. The Ukrainians are relying on new types of drones, especially on the Hornet drones that are flying over this region or between Crimea and Donetsk region, and the Russians are trying to stabilize the situation with their own drones and the drones of their own production.